Good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar discussing the Nebraska Economic Outlook for the next 3 years. This webinar is being presented by the Bureau of Business Research at the University of Nebraska, but I should say that the forecast that I'll discuss has been developed by the Nebraska Business Forecast Council, which is a group of economists in the state that comes together to develop these forecasts twice a year. It includes economists from the University of Nebraska, from state government, and from the Nebraska Public Power District. So I'm pleased to report today the results. My name is Eric Thompson, and I'm the director of the Bureau of Business Research and a member of the Nebraska Business Forecast Council. Before I get started, I just want to point out a few features of our webinar. So we have a question and answer window that you can click on your bar, which I think is at the bottom of your screen. And you can ask a question at any time, or hold your question and ask it at the end of the PowerPoint presentation. I will be answering questions at the end of the PowerPoint presentation. The other feature we have is we have some poll questions, 2 poll questions that we'll ask of the participants over the course of the webinar. And you'll be asked to give your opinion on 2 subjects and go ahead and vote. And then we'll review what the participants thought and gather some information to answer the poll question at the appropriate time in the webinar. So with those 2 points made, I'm going to go ahead and get started reviewing the economic outlook for the state of Nebraska. We'll start with doing a U.S. economic outlook. Obviously, there's a lot in common between the U.S. and Nebraska economy, so it's important to start there, and then the Nebraska economic outlook. So start with the U.S. economic forecast. So the COVID-19 pandemic has upended the U.S., and I could say Nebraska economy as well, and has pushed the U.S. economy into recession. Every recession is different, has a different nature to it, and often a very different cause. This particular recession has been characterized by a deep decline in industries which require face-to-face interaction between customers and workers, or industries which serve travelers or tend to serve large crowds of people. Consumers have tended to avoid such businesses due to health concerns, and also the government, in many cases, especially if you look nationwide, has required closures or very strict regulation of a number of those businesses. And of course, that's led to significant drops in revenue, and is the reason those particular industries are especially hard hit. And I should say, in addition to those types of business, portions of the healthcare industry also have been impacted as they've been asked to close for a period to concentrate for a variety of reasons, including concentrating healthcare capacity on activities related to COVID-19. Now, as those sectors have been hard hit, it's also true that manufacturing and agriculture have had a number of challenges. So the COVID-19 pandemic has led to a global recession in addition to here in the United States, and that's had the effect of depressing commodity prices, depressing exports from the U.S., and of course those factors have a big impact on the manufacturing and agricultural industries around the country, and certainly here in Nebraska. Lastly, because we're in a recession, the impacts on the economy have spread beyond these hard-hit sectors to the economy broadly. So most if not all industries are seeing some decline. Now, we've had aggressive monetary policy, we've had aggressive federal government spending, and these things have helped limit the overall losses in the economy. And we've also had strict social distancing in some of the hardest hit regions like New York City that has helped reduce the spread of the disease in those hot spots in the country. Okay, so here is the first poll question. So take a little break in the presentation. So this is what we'd like each one of you to answer, give your opinion. Given the monetary and fiscal policy that I just spoke about, and the uncertainty facing the U.S. economy, what do you think will happen with inflation in 2020? Will it be unusually high, more than 2.5%? Will it be about average, 1.5% to 2%, or it will be unusually low, less than 1%? So go ahead and answer that poll question, and we'll go ahead and review the answers a little bit later when we get to the appropriate part of the PowerPoint. Okay, turning back then to the U.S. economic outlook. So we talked about some of the challenges the economy has been facing, but I think the positive news, or at least encouraging news, is I think we're set up now with that monetary and fiscal policy, with the progress that's been made, at least in some of the hot spots in the country, with reducing the spread of the virus, that the economy can begin a recovery, and I think it'll be a stronger than typical recovery from recession. On a national basis, it can begin a recovery in May or at least early June. Progress on fighting COVID-19 in some of the hardest hit regions around the country. Customers and businesses obviously will need to adapt to interact more safely, and so customers feel secure and willing to return to some of their previous spending and retail habits and other consumer habits. Obviously, businesses will have to adapt to changes that have occurred in consumer preferences. Now, the one exception where I think it'll especially take longer for recovery to occur would be in sectors related to travel, or where they serve industries where you have to have large crowds of customers, like baseball games and things like that. So those probably will be delayed in their return. But many of the hard-hit sectors, we believe the recovery can start in May or early June at the national level, perhaps faster here in Nebraska. Okay, so what's the bottom line of the U.S. economic forecast? As hinted in the last slide, U.S. economy should recover rapidly in the second half of 2020. If you look at the whole year of 2020, compare it to 2019, I think GDP will decline by between 4% and 6%. Obviously, it's a highly uncertain situation. It's hard to put a specific number on it, but the decline will be in the range of 4% to 6%, which is by historical standards, obviously a pretty severe contraction. Similar decline in employment for the whole year at the national level. But as the year goes on, the economy will be recovering more and more. And because of that, and because of continued recovery in 2021, we're going to get a lot of that loss back at the national level. So in 2021, much of what was lost in 2020 will be recovered in terms of GDP growth and employment growth. In 2022, remember this is a 3-year forecast, we think we'll have pretty typical, maybe slightly rapid by recent standards, GDP growth of 2.5%, and employment usually comes back a little slower than GDP, so we'll still be catching up on employment and should have relatively strong growth of 1.5% in the U.S. So that is the outlook for the U.S. economy. Now, I see many of you have voted here in the answer to the first poll question, and we're ready now to review your answers. So as you can see there, about 55% of people, because of all that stimulus and economic and monetary policy, are concerned that inflation will be unusually high in 2020, above 2.5%. And about a third of people thought it would be unusually low, with about 1 in 6 expecting pretty typical inflation in 2020. So what our forecasting council predicts actually is it'll be an unusually low rate of inflation. So with the weak demand in many parts of the economy, and I know there's some bottlenecks out there and so forth, but with the weak demand, we think inflation will be quite low, maybe just around 0.5% in 2020. However, after that, inflation should get back to more of a normal level, like 2021 and 2022. Okay, so let's look now at the outlook for the Nebraska economy. So the Nebraska economy obviously is also hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, in the last week or so, there have been some worrying trends in terms of the spread of COVID-19 here in Nebraska. However, in our outlook, we're expecting the virus will be ultimately contained here in the state. And for that and other reasons, we think that the economic contraction here in Nebraska, while it'll still be significant, will be a lot less severe in Nebraska than it is nationally. It's still a very significant economic contraction, a lot of challenges and pain out there in the Nebraska economy, but we don't think it'll be as bad as nationwide. Variety of reasons for that. One is that Nebraska has a smaller share of its economy in those most heavily impacted sectors. So travel and tourism, major tourism attractions. We have a few, but we're not as reliant on that as many states. We don't have as much going on with travel and tourism. And because of that, I think we'll avoid some of the hardest impacts that you'll see in states like Nevada and Florida and so forth. Also, if you look at our production industry, we're not specialized in some of the very hardest hit industries like automobile parts and assembly or oil production. A lot of the oil states, Texas, North Dakota, are being severely impacted with the very low oil prices, and we don't have that, and we don't have a lot of the support industries either. So we're not as specialized in some of the hardest hit industries. Another factor is a larger share of the Nebraska economy are in sectors which will be especially, which will be hit, but it'll be less hard hit. So food production and processing. Obviously, we've had some challenges especially in some of our meat processing plants, ethanol industry, but these industries, food processing, are going to be stable. They're necessities. And even in a period of the sharp recession, there's going to be a need there. So that's helpful in terms of the impact of the recession here in Nebraska. Finally, we are a state that specializes in finance and insurance, and those are two industries where there's more potential for people to work at home. Those industries are impacted and disrupted quite a bit as well, but perhaps less so than some of the industries we've talked about. So Nebraska should be less hard hit than the national economy in this severe recession. It's actually somewhat similar to what we saw during the Great Recession 12 years ago, where it was a significant recession in Nebraska, but not as severe as nationwide. Some other factors to keep track of. I think this helped us 12 years ago as well. Nebraska has a more flexible, adaptable workforce, very high education attainment in the state, at least at the basic level. Very high labor force participation. So just a lot of people with a good record in the labor force, making them flexible and adaptable. We do tend to have more smaller businesses, being a small metro and rural state. Smaller businesses obviously can be more adaptable in some ways. A lot less, fewer bureaucratic rules coming from the national office. So that may be helpful in adapting. Obviously, smaller businesses sometimes don't have as many financial resources, but there's potential that our small business economy will make us more flexible. Now, one, I guess, negative or thing to consider is Nebraska is less involved in some of the sectors that might expand in the future. We're going to expand anyway, but where the pandemic might accelerate the expansion of these sectors, things like e-commerce or streaming services or related things, we're not as strong there, so that we may have fewer opportunities in that area. But by and large, there's a lot of reasons why Nebraska might be somewhat better situated than many parts of the nation. Okay, so let's get into the details. Before I do that, I do want to ask our second poll question. So in the December forecast, our last economic forecast that we produced, Nebraska employment was forecast to grow 2.1% cumulatively during the years 2020, 21, and 22. So about 0.7% per year on average. How much will it grow cumulatively in those 3 years in our current forecast? So will it be 1.4% cumulatively after things bounce back? About 2/3 as fast? Will it be about 1% cumulatively? Less than half as fast? Or will we have no growth? We'll recover what's lost, but won't have more employment in 2020 than we had in 2019. So go ahead and register your opinion, and then we'll have the answer pop up here as we continue through the PowerPoint presentation. So let's look at some of those hardest hit sectors. So retail trade, obviously very hard hit sector due to the social distancing and all of those reasons. So the retail trade employment is expected to decline by around 4% for the year as a whole. So obviously the drop in retail employment is more severe than that right now, but we think there'll be a bounce back in employment. Remember, employment was pretty good in retail in January and February before the pandemic struck with full force. So if you take the year as a whole, 2020 compared to 2019, retail trade employment will be down, we're expecting, by 3.9%. Now the industry will recover in 2021, so 2.4% more employment in retail trade in 2021 than in 2020, but then we expect a further decline in employment. Let me emphasize, this is employment, not sales, in the year 2022. That's just a long-term trend in this industry, given the transition to e-commerce. So retail employment won't come back fully. Services will be another hard-hit sector. It's expected to fall by 3.6% during the year 2020 as a whole. Obviously, right now, restaurants are in services, barbershops are in services, hotels are in services. So there's a pretty severe decline in services employment right now, but if you look at the year as a whole, we think it'll be down 3.6%. Healthcare also is in services. Now, the industry will bounce back, and in 2021, it'll grow by 3.1% and almost get all of the job loss back by 2021. And then there'll be strong job growth in 2022 as well. So we think services are hard hit, but they will return as an engine of job growth for our economy by the end of this 3-year period. Okay, those are the hardest hit sectors. Now let's look at some of the other sectors that are more significantly impacted, like Nebraska agriculture. So the global recession from COVID-19 has certainly affected commodity prices in the agricultural sector. Another factor with flight to safety is the value of the US dollar has risen a lot. All of those things make prices more challenged for agriculture. We've also had the virus outbreaks in some of our meat processing plants here, either here in Nebraska or nearby in neighboring states. All those things have impacted Nebraska farmers and ranchers. And then we've also had a sharp decline in ethanol. For the same reason the oil industry has been impacted. People aren't traveling as much here or around the globe. So all of those things have been a challenge for Nebraska agriculture. Now, on the, I don't want to say this is the positive side, but it's been helpful that government payments are supporting income, so the income loss won't be as severe as you might have expected after looking at the previous slide. I think, clearly a positive development is we do think next year, 2021, 2022, government payments may drop off, but commodity prices will improve, and therefore, while we will have a drop in farm income in 2020, we should have stability, maybe even slight growth in 2021 and 2022, and importantly, the growth will be earned income rather than government payments. So here's the outlook for Nebraska agriculture. You can see the drop in forecast farm income in 2020 of about 23%, but then stability and maybe a little growth after that. Okay, let's look at the manufacturing industry. So again, the global economy is impacting manufacturing, the global recession. Rising US dollar is hurting exports. Trade tensions continue to be an issue. So there's a number of things impacting manufacturing broadly. And of course, ethanol is part of the manufacturing industry. So that's been a negative within the manufacturing sector. But generally speaking, despite what's going on broadly in manufacturing, Nebraska's mix of manufacturing industries is probably helpful for for our manufacturing employment, holding up a little better than it is nationwide. Again, more of our employment is in those essential industries like food processing, less of our employment in autos and mining equipment, things like that. So we think Nebraska will lose about 2,500 jobs in its manufacturing sector in 2020, but we'll get most of those jobs back in 2021 and 2022. Let's look at some other sectors. So these are, I guess, maybe not, these are sectors that aren't as impacted directly by the COVID-19 pandemic, but certainly will be indirectly impacted as the contraction spreads throughout the economy. So these industries will lose about 1% of employment, but employment will bounce back in 2021 and 2022 in sectors like construction, financial services, and even in our outlook for state and local government employment. Okay, we're ready to talk about our answer to poll question 2. So let's see what people said. So about 1 in 6, 1 in 7 said that cumulative growth will be 1.4%, or about 2/3 as fast as we were projecting before. The vast majority, more than 2/3, said about 1% cumulatively, and about 1 in 6 saying no cumulative growth. So here is our bottom line for total non-farm employment growth in Nebraska. We're expecting about 2.4% job loss in 2020, again for the year as a whole. Right now, jobs have declined by more than that, but if you take 2020 as a whole, that's the loss we're expecting. We'll get most of that job loss back in 2021, and then power ahead in 2022. If you add those numbers up, you see that respondents to the poll question were right, and by and large, and that the cumulative job growth will be around 1% for the 3-year period. So this is another way to look at the recovery. We think it'll be a strong recovery. However, whenever you have a recession, it does set you back, at least for a few years, and cumulative job growth is only going to be about 45%. Well, the growth in employment from 2019 to 2022 is only going to be about 1% cumulative rather than 2.1%, so about half as much. So that's the long run or medium run impact, if you will. Okay, let's talk about non-farm income, obviously another important measure of the economy. So we are expecting in 2020 a sharp decline in income from wages and salaries, proprietor income, income from dividend interest and rent. A lot of companies are slashing their dividend or eliminating their dividend for a period here. So those will be declining. Again, I don't know if you want to say on the positive side, but what will be very helpful is there's going to be a very rapid increase in transfer payments. This is an intentional policy by the federal government. So what are called economic impact payments, those are those one-time checks, $1,200 checks per person that many have been receiving, and then the enhanced unemployment insurance benefits, and then just the normal people retiring as they reach age 65 or 70, depending on when they want to retire. That'll also increase transfer payments as well. But those are the main things, the economic impact payments and the enhanced unemployment insurance. That's really going to increase the income from transfer payments. And I should say that the Paycheck Protection Program has helped reduce the amount of job loss we're seeing. It's helped tremendously. So wage and salaries aren't falling as much as they would have otherwise. And that's obviously been a big help as well. So the bottom line, when you add all that up, is that we will have a decline in non-farm income in Nebraska in 2020, but it won't be as severe as it might have been. I think I skipped ahead here a little bit. Okay, and then we're going to look at taxable sales as well. So obviously with a decline in non-farm income and somewhat of a decline, and with a 23% decline in farm income, there's going to be some limit to how fast taxable sales can grow. Obviously, there's been other factors at work here. Some of the sectors where that have been most heavily impacted are the sectors where sales tax is charged, like restaurants and retail and so forth. And so we've seen a rotation from people spending money in restaurants, which are subject to the sales tax, to spending on groceries, which are often not subject to the sales tax. So that's been a factor as well. Automobile sales are also down. So what is our, so we also have a forecast for calendar year 2020, the whole year, January through December. And we're expecting taxable sales to decline, and even decline a little faster than they did during the Great Recession 12 years ago. So what's the bottom line of some of these things? Non-farm personal income will decline by 0.8% in 2020. It'll improve in 2021 to 2.2%. Now, job growth should be back in 2021. However, we're going to lose some of those transfer payments, well, many of those transfer payments that we received in 2020. So that'll limit the overall growth in income in 2021. Then 2022 will be more of a typical year with 3% growth in non-farm personal income. And the growth in 2022 will be about double the inflation rate. So that'll be real income growth. Taxable sales, expecting a decline of 4.3% in 2020 for the whole calendar year. Bounce back to 6.4% in 2021, and you see the result there for 2022. We think, or I think that the population will grow a little bit faster in Nebraska in 2020. We saw this during the Great Recession as well, because our economy, while severely impacted, will not be as impacted as hard as much as the nation as a whole. We'll probably see a few more people staying in or moving to Nebraska in 2020, so slightly faster population growth than we usually have. Okay, those are the main points that I wanted to make, and now I'd be happy to answer the poll questions that are coming in. So, one question. First, I see two questions here. The first one, you stated industries related to travel and crowds would be later coming on board. What is later in your opinion? So, I would expect in the case of travel, that would be more like in the fall, where airlines and so forth will get the procedures in place, and people's level of comfort with those procedures will rise, and we'll start to see that come back occur. In terms of large crowds, it could be much could be later than that. Obviously, there can be difference between indoor and outdoor events in that regard. Second question, what about low agricultural commodity prices? Won't that hurt our Nebraska economic outlook? Yes, so it definitely has been hurting our Nebraska economic outlook. Although I think the low agricultural commodity prices have not seen the collapse in price this year that we've seen in the oil industry. If you take a long-term view, yes, ag commodity prices are much lower than they were 6 or 7 years ago. But the hardest hit sectors in terms of industry are, in terms of commodities, are the commodities where the prices have just collapsed. That obviously affects our ethanol sector here, but it also mostly affects energy prices and some of the other commodities. So it definitely has hurt our economic outlook, that agriculture is facing these low commodity prices. You saw that drop in farm income. Would have been much more severe if it wasn't for the surge in government payments that we're seeing this year. Another question that I'm seeing is, how do you see meat processing plant closures in Dakota, Hall, Dawson, all the other counties reflected in Nebraska's economic recovery? So I think this, again, is part of the reason why we're expecting farm incomes to fall this year. And obviously when agriculture suffers, that's a big negative for the Nebraska economy. But I think while there may be periodic closures in these meat processing plants going forward, by and large they'll be up and operating, so that will limit the negative impact for our economy. Obviously the spread of the COVID-19 virus in those plants has been part of the reason we've seen an increase in COVID-19 cases in Nebraska. But but I think by and large, Nebraska's economy will be able to recover. What is your forecast? Another question, what is your forecast for state and local fiscal impact? So you can see the forecast for taxable sales. So that obviously is going to be significant for state and local revenues. Income is also going to decline in 2020. In fact, transfer payment income won't be taxable, so taxable income will decline perhaps more sharply than that. So that does create a negative situation, a challenging situation for state and local finances. Another question is, any indication on the impact on the broader nonprofit sector, human services, art, and such? So I would expect a challenging situation for the nonprofit sector. I think a lot of attention is going to be focused on the healthcare fight that we have currently and have ahead of us, and that may impact attention to other parts of the nonprofit sector. Obviously, human services, social distancing can have effects there, and things such as art or nonprofit, the events, the fundraisers for nonprofit organizations. Those could be significantly impacted this year because of limits on crowds or people being reluctant to go to events where there's large crowds. So that is one of the sectors that will be impacted. Often the nonprofit sector is actually considered part of the services sector, and you saw that we were expecting pretty significant job loss in the services sector during 2020, and you can see that would include in the nonprofit sector. Any thoughts about the long-run changes to Nebraska's economy due to COVID-19? Well, I think there's a lot of potential things there. There's a pretty significant impact on the ethanol industry. Will there be any lingering impacts there is one question. I think around the country, well, here in Nebraska and around the country, at least some people have had, we've all had a lot of new experiences related to the pandemic and having to spend more time at home and so forth. But I think for some people that were maybe casual online shoppers or had not participated in online shopping, they may have needed to do that during this period. And so people are gaining experience with things like online shopping. People and their employers are gaining experience with things like shopping from home. So I do expect that some of the trends we've seen will accelerate towards e-commerce. There may be some impacts on the commercial real estate demand in the long run. If companies get more comfortable with having their staff work at home. There also, if companies have become more comfortable with their staff working at home, there might be some positives too in terms of hiring people on a part-time basis when those workers would prefer to work at home. So I do think we'll see an acceleration in some trends and some changes in behavior. But I also think that, as you go out a few years, by and large, I think the economy can recover, and many of our practices and habits will be back to what they were in terms of shopping, dining out, traveling, and so forth. Okay, I don't see any other questions. So I realize this webinar is a little longer than we usually have, but I guess it's the nature of the topic today. I sure appreciate you participating. This is our last webinar of the year, but we will be back in the fall with a new webinar series. We'll be announcing that later in the summer. Of course, you can follow the Bureau of Business Research. We'll be constantly providing updates on the economy. You can see the various ways to follow us or just send us an email at bbr@unl.edu, and we will get you on our email list. So thank you again for participating today.